L'Honorable Député de Churchill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, Canadians are witnessing the anti-democratic, ideological agenda of the Conservative government. Western Canadians today are witnessing a government take a position without listening to the very voices of the people they claim to represent. Today, many Canadians will realize the way in which this federal government doesn't represent us, and why it's time to talk about the need to have real representation about the real issues that matter to Canadians. I want to begin by responding to the allegations made in this House these last few days that have involved my name. I am very disappointed by the allegations made by the member of Regina Lumsden Lake Centre and the Chief Government Whip. The Government Whip approached me last week after a disruption in the gallery and accused me of organizing it. I made it clear that this was not the case. In Parliament, we are all honourable members, and the acceptance of the word of a Member of Parliament is fundamental to the functioning of this House.
So what's wrong with that?
Instead of accepting my word as a member of this House, the Chief Government Whip approached me in this very chamber and indicated to me the phrase, "You will get attacked." He went on to repeat the fictional story that he and his colleagues shared in this House. I want to make it clear that I provided gallery passes to a group of Western farmers who support the Wheat Board. I provide passes, like so many members of Parliament, to people that visit their House of Commons. I had no knowledge there would be a disruption. For the record, that member of the public that protested in this gallery just hours later apologized to me and noted that I had no knowledge of his intentions and certainly had no part in organizing. The government members instead were eager to make unfounded accusations and attempts to intimidate me. This attitude is not fitting for a government that was elected to represent Canadians. This House operates on the basis of honouring members, of honouring the word of members, and of honouring the fact that we have been elected to represent Canadians. I believe the Whip should withdraw his statement and apologize to this House. This attitude is a reflection of this government's contempt for anyone who disagrees with them. And I want to make one thing clear. I will not be intimidated by members opposite. I know they have a difficulty with the fact, given that I represent a rural Western Canadian riding. And I have news for them. If they continue down this path of arrogance, ideology, and contempt for the voices of Western Canadians, they will see a lot more New Democratic Party members of Parliament representing Western Canada. Mr. Speaker, the lessons of this government's desire to pursue its extreme ideological agenda on Bill C-18 and dismantling the Canadian Wheat Board is a reflection of patterns we've seen in history before. Might I reference the Mulroney Conservatives, who after taking Western Canada for granted time and time again, were rewarded by being re-elected with only 2 seats in the House of Commons. None of them were from Western Canada. And that process led to the beginning of a social movement and a political movement in Western Canada known as the Reform Party. Many of these members of Parliament came out of that movement. Some have since retired, some are still today here. These people came out of a movement that spoke about democracy, that talked about listening to the grassroots, that talked about respecting the democratic voice of people across Western Canada. They talked about the West wanting in and people from Western Canada wanting to be heard. very same people, these same members of Parliament, have today denied Western Canadian farmers the right to vote. And along with that, they have denied Western Canadians, people that live across the prairie provinces, whose livelihoods depend on the work of the Canadian Wheat Board, the ability to speak to oppose this. They talked about having campaigned to dismantle the Wheat Board, a statement that for many of our constituencies is completely and utterly false. They buried it in a platform, and we hear from people across the prairies that nowhere was it actually talked about in debates, in campaign events, and in their pamphlets that were handed out during election. I can speak to the fact in Churchill, where the Conservative candidate, based in the community that stands to lose the most directly with the loss of the Wheat Board, the community of Churchill, never once made public reference to this government's plan to dismantle an institution on which so many of the people that I represent depend on. We even have the minister's quote in Minnedosa, Manitoba, who talked about respecting farmers' right to vote. And yet, days later, after winning a majority government, this government became so arrogant, became so dismissive of its own commitments in the election prior, became so dismissive of the very statements government members had made to Western Canadians, that we now have them pursuing the exact opposite approach, and that we have them put forward an agenda in this debate and a timeline in this debate that is unprecedented for the way in which it has been able to muzzle any kind of opposition across Canada. The last while, I've had a chance to talk a lot about the old politics, the politics of this government, the politics that Canadians are sick and tired of, the politics of hidden agendas, hearing one thing during the election and then electing them and hearing something completely different. Hearing how once they get a majority, they are willing to steamroll the rights of Western Canadians and steamroll anyone who might be in their way and who might have a differing point of view. They have brought in closure time and time again, and in a most shocking way when it's come to Bill C-18, a tool that signifies their complete lack of respect for Canadians' voices, Canadians that have something different to bring to the table, Canadians that simply want to be heard. And instead of listening, they've managed to keep busy in a number of other ways. They've kept busy by making insulting videos that insult Aboriginal people in the statements they make, videos that demean Western Canadian producers. They've sought ways to bury debate and use public relations stunts with government money when it comes to ads in order to be able to take away the important role that Parliament has to debate these very issues. And instead of being upfront, we've seen them obfuscate and hide the actual facts that we need to know as we move forward. On the contingency fund, it is clear that this government is taking the money of farmers and putting it towards their own state-run agency, having lifted the ceiling instead of giving that very money back to farmers. I want to acknowledge the work of people that were elected to represent Western Canadian farmers. Stuart Wells, Bill Woods, Alan Oberg, Cam Goff, Kyle Kornichuk, Rod Flamen, John Sanborn, Bill Taves, the voices of young farmers such as Sid Stevenson, Matt Gell, the people of Churchill, of the Bayline, of Winnipeg, the people across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and even parts of British Columbia. The people whose voices need to be heard in this House. The people that this government is taken for granted. And mark our words that as we stand here to bring voice to those very people, to Western Canadians, and to all Canadians, we're going to make sure that they know that the arrogance, the ideological agenda, and the undemocratic approach of this government is unacceptable, and that next time around, that we will build a government that actually represents Canadians.
Questions and comments? Questions of Parliamentary